So Stuart Campbell, blogger who goes by the name of Wings Over Scotland. Thanks very much for talking to the Scottish Sun today. Um, we're obviously talking about Peter Murrell and the scandal of the SNP finances, which is obviously goes back 12 years, at least his offending goes all the way back to 2010. You were one of the first people, potentially even the first person, to write about concerns about SNP finances all the way back in 2020, I believe. You've been portrayed for years as a conspiracy theorist. I think that's fair to say, but presumably you think that that's been debunked now.
Yeah, I think we can fairly safely say our coverage of the story has been vindicated at this point.
And when you started looking into this, can you take us through your thought process when you were looking at the SNP accounts at that time?
Yeah, I mean, the remarkable thing really is how simple and straightforward it was. I was friendly with a few people in the SNP NEC back in 2019. This was, and some of them said to me, "Look, see, we're trying to get somewhere, finding out what's happened to all this fundraising money, and we can't get any answers. Can you take a look at it?" So I said, "Sure." And I went and had a look at the accounts, and it couldn't be clearer. You didn't have to be an accountant. You didn't have to do any sort of clever investigation. You just had to look at the numbers, and the money wasn't there. It was as simple as that.
And when you were doing that, I mean, we obviously know now that Peter Murrell's, embezzled more than £400,000 from the SNP. That's been proven in a court of law. When you were looking at this initially, did you actually think that Peter Murrell or someone else was stealing money from the SNP, or were your
No,
concerns about like the truthfulness of the leadership?
yeah, absolutely. The second one, we had absolutely no reason at that point to suspect that anyone was stealing the money for their own personal advancement. As far as we could tell, the money had just been spent on SNP stuff, which they had furiously insisted it wouldn't be.
I think Joanna Cherry said this week, the leadership and their lackeys were terrified of this website and threatened any of us who retweeted it with expulsion from the party. You must wear that as a bit of a badge of pride.
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, it was Graham Campbell, the Glasgow councillor, who was on the NEC at the time, who went on the record saying that basically reading Wings, retweeting Wings, talking to Wings, discussing Wings in any way should be a matter for being thrown out of the party. And given his particular personal history, that is very much a badge of pride.
And I mean, you were very much on the fringes of the SNP by this point, and of the independence movement. I mean, do you think that there was a culture then? I think I know the answer to this question. Did you think that there was a culture then where, any questions of Nicola Sturgeon and the party leadership was viewed as a threat rather than as, normal kind of back and forth that you'd expect in a political party?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's been very clear, I think, since very early in Nicola Sturgeon's reign as party leader and first minister, and we were picking up some of this on Wings back in 2015, 2016, unrelated to the finances, just Sturgeon's general distaste for being challenged in any way. Her self-confessed imposter syndrome is something that tends to make people very paranoid. And when you're very paranoid, you see anyone of any talent or insight or ability as a threat to your own position. So that's why she forced out people like Joanna Cherry. It's why she was so hostile to Alex Salmond and scared of him coming back. It was very much obvious even back then that Sturgeon was a very, very controlling and centralising figure in the party.
We'll come back to Nicola, but I'm interested. You will have presumably been, like everyone else, interested in this story last Monday, looking at and waiting for the plea to come from court. What was your reaction? What was your feeling when you heard that Peter Murrell had pleaded guilty?
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked. I was expecting it to be some kind of fairly minor procedural hearing. People hadn't bigged it up as anything in particular. We thought he might possibly enter a guilty plea. I certainly wasn't expecting him to be hauled off to the chokey there and then. I was completely caught by surprise.
And what's your characterization of John Swinney's response to this in the last week since his guilty plea?
Yeah, I mean that's been quite extraordinary. He seems to be a man who's been dropped into the middle of a burning building and doesn't quite understand that it's on fire somehow. He's been flailing around in all sorts of directions. And I mean he's been largely avoiding what I think is the issue. I mean there have been two crimes here. There's the disappearance of the fundraiser money and there's Peter Murrell's personal embezzlement of them. And only one of them has been addressed. And that was, I think, very much the way Swinney was trying to keep it. He was trying to keep all the focus on Peter Murrell and avoid talking about the fundraiser money. So a couple of days ago, I tweeted that somebody really had to ask him about that. Somebody had to say, if you're saying, John, that this is all in the past and all over and done with, and there's no more questions to be answered, then tell us where the fundraiser money is. And finally, someone did that yesterday, and just he he didn't even really seem to have the wit to just try and fob the question off. He just had to say, "Well, it isn't there. We've spent it,"
Mm-hmm.
and that is a very significant development that we'll be having rather more on wings in the very very near future.
Let's talk a bit about like that background to what Swinney was saying this week about the where the independence referendum crowdfunding funds has gone. I mean, if we look back in 2021, Colin Beattie was talking about it being woven through the overall income figures each year. Nicola Sturgeon obviously was saying there was no missing money. Swinney, as you mentioned, said the cash, effectively admitted the cash was being used for day-to-day activities of the SNP. I mean, what do you think the truth is here? Because the truth seems to be that John Swinney and co are not quite willing to say what is evident by just looking at the accounts.
I think he did say that yesterday. The truth is that the money was spent very early on SNP activities. I mean, you can't. Each fibre doesn't have a note on it that says exactly where it came from. It was all in one big pot. But the most obvious explanation seems to be that they owed Chris and Colin Weir £500,000 at that time, back in 2017 when the first fundraiser was launched. They urgently had to pay that back. They had almost no money in the bank, and they raised £500,000 and then almost immediately paid the Weirs off with what appears to be the fundraiser money. The fundraiser money was only in the SNP's account for about 6 months. The fundraiser closed in June 2017. On the 1st of December 2017, they paid £500,000 back to Chris and Colin Weir to clear the last of a loan they'd made to them to fight the 2016 election. So it seems to me, looking at the accounts, and so far as you can attribute any particular pound of spending to anything, that the SNP raised that money with the purpose of paying off a loan to the Weirs that I imagine had to be paid quite urgently because the Weirs were quite publicly disgruntled with the SNP at that time. And that was it. It was raised for that purpose, in my opinion, and used for that purpose, and has been gone ever since. It's been gone since 2017.
And would you say that, this refusal, particularly when you were starting to raise concerns about this money, was part of the cover-up of where this cash had gone? The responses from everybody, that's what this fundamentally is a cover-up at the heart of the SNP.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that their intent was that they would gradually recover the £500,000 that they'd raised just through normal activities. This was a time when the SNP were bringing in the best part of £3 million a year in membership fees alone. So, and in years where there isn't a general election, the SNP tend to make a substantial profit. So I think their plan was to just quietly recoup that money over non-election years, knowing that there wasn't going to be another independence referendum anytime soon, because the SNP don't really want another independence referendum. And then the crime would be effectively covered up, and before anybody had ever noticed the money was missing, the money would be back. And then, unfortunately, there were two snap general elections in 2017 and 2019, which took a huge hunk out of the party's bank balance. I think we spent about £3 million on those two elections, and they've never been able to get to a point where they could build that money back up. And then in 2020, and then in 2020, we noticed it, and that the cat was out the bag. And ever since then, they've been fighting a sort of frantic rearguard action.
I mean, John Swinney, I think his claim appears to be that the SNP have the right to spend the donations that's been given to them for anything that they want. Their argument would be that their whole reason for existence is campaigning for independence. I imagine that you wouldn't agree with that, and that this cash shouldn't have been used in the way that it was.
No, I mean, absolutely. That is the only kind of avenue they've got left now after all their other ridiculous excuses have fallen apart. But that just doesn't stand up to the tiniest bit of scrutiny. It's common law fraud under Scots law. You cannot raise money, you can't solicit money for a specific purpose and then not use it for that purpose. You can't just spend it on something else. Also, partly because, as Ian Blackford, I think, admitted in the House of Commons, this money didn't just come from SNP supporters. This money came from people of all kinds of political persuasions who might not support the SNP but do support independence. There are a very substantial number of Labour voters, Tory voters, Reform voters who all do still support independence. So for them to donate money to the SNP on the premise that it was being ring-fenced for a referendum campaign and not for SNP purposes, and then for that money to be spent on the SNP, which is to say, in a general election, say, against Labour or Tories or Reform or the Lib Dems or whoever, these people are donating money and then having it spent against their interests. So, I mean, all of that is just unambiguously, clearly illegal. It's, in my opinion, very clearly fraudulently criminal. And you can't just do that. You just can't ask somebody for money that you're going to give to a starving kittens society and then spend it all buying yourself Lalique pepper pots.
As you point out, there's lots of pro-independence grassroots activists who donated to this pot of money. You speak to a lot of SNP, ex-SNP members. What's the reaction about this scandal from those grassroots supporters of independence and the SNP who you speak to?
I mean, they're understandably furious. I mean, we've already seen talk of people mounting individual or class action lawsuits to try and get money back. The SNP have at times refunded, excuse me, people who asked for their referendum fund contributions back, which amounts to an admission that they haven't been used for what they were used for. As I say, there's going to be some significant developments from Wings in the next hours or days on that subject, and I think Sean Clerkin has also reignited his complaint to the police, saying it hasn't been addressed, which is quite right, it hasn't been. So I think this story's got a very, very long way to run.
I mean, let's go back to the last week or so. I mean, I imagine you were among those who watched Nicola Sturgeon on Laura Kuenssberg on the BBC on Sunday. What did you make of that interview?
I mean, I thought it was an extraordinary depiction of a woman falling apart under the strain, to be honest. I mean, after she came out on Monday and said, "Here is my dignified statement, I will not be making any further statement." And then she made another statement, or more than one statement, every day from then until the weekend, and then gives an hour-long interview to Laura Kuenssberg. That is somebody who is not in control of the situation. In my opinion, that's somebody who feels the walls closing in on her. Nicola Sturgeon is, of course, primarily responsible for what happened regarding those fundraisers. She was the first minister and the party leader in 2017 to 2019 when the money was taken in. I think she is currently very, very nervous and has every reason to be nervous.
Do you have any sympathy for her position?
Not a shred, no.
And I mean, critics in the SNP would say that claims like from people like yourself about a cover-up of financial issues weren't justified and rooted in people being out to get Nicola Sturgeon. I think two things can probably be true at once, can't they? I mean, you definitely spotted something amiss, and you also had it in for the leadership.
I mean, I didn't have it in for the leadership in 2019. Wing's real criticism of the SNP started in 2020 because of Sturgeon's failure to deliver any kind of strategy for independence, or the way that she spent her whole time trying to stop the UK leaving the EU, and against the will of the people of England and Wales who voted to leave the EU, rather than try and carve out anything for Scotland as Northern Ireland got. She just tried to override the result of the Brexit referendum, which I thought was a very, very bad strategy. I think she squandered the best chance we will ever have of getting a second independence referendum. She squandered incredibly favourable circumstances, and that was why Wings turned against the SNP. But all of that happened around about the same time as we spotted these financial irregularities, and our real criticisms of the SNP only date from then. We didn't have any particular hostility before that time.
I mean, so you would reject the idea that you've never been a massive fan of Nicola Sturgeon?
I mean, massive fan would be overstating it, but I thought she was a strong leader up until 2017, 2018, and grew increasingly skeptical from then onwards as she sort of continued to fail to maximise the circumstances that she had in front of her. And obviously and particularly when she got involved in the conspiracy against Alex Salmond.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you became quite close with Alex Salmond in the later years of his life. At a time when the two of them had fallen out, and I think probably would have considered each other's nemesis. I mean, do you think that coloured your view of Sturgeon? Do you think it impacted how you looked at this scandal at all?
It coloured my view of Sturgeon, certainly. Of course it did. But I don't think it impacted my view of this scandal. This scandal stands entirely on its own merits, as subsequent events have proved. The money is missing. They have admitted the core allegation that we made in 2020, which is that the money had just vanished into the party's coffers and been used for party purposes. All of that has proven simply to be factually true. And it's an entirely separate issue to the conspiracy against Salmond, which has also been proven true. He was innocent of any crime, and there is no real credible doubt as to who was organising the persecution of him.
I mean, there's some SNP sources, senior SNP sources, who've told us that this issue with the SNP financial governance dates back to Alex Salmond. What would you say to that?
I have no idea what basis they would be making that on, since this is an issue that arose in 2017, 3 years after he resigned as First Minister. I can't even begin to imagine what they're thinking about there.
They're talking about things like spending controls within the party that allowed morals embezzlement rather than necessarily how the independence referendum cash was spent.
I mean, well, again, Alec left in 2014. From 2014 onwards, that was the responsibility of Nicola Sturgeon, John Swinney, and Colin Beattie. And it's not like it's not like they weren't told. One of the stories that we broke exclusively on Wings was the resignation of 3 members of the Finance Committee. That's in 2017. You can't put that on Alex Salmond. 3 members of the Finance Committee and the Treasurer have all quit, saying we're not being allowed to look at the finances properly. That's on Peter Murrell. That's on Nicola Sturgeon. And when that was brought to her attention, and she just waved it away and showed absolutely no interest in even glancing at the accounts to notice the very obvious absence of £600,000 that ostensibly should have been there, I think it's extremely desperate to be trying to lay that at Alex's door. How
would you characterise the culture at the SNP when you in 2017 to 2021, you know, when all of these major issues were kind of coming to a head?
I would describe it as a corrupt dictatorship.
Just that.
that seems to sum it up, frankly. I mean, we've kind of talked about the further details, but that is what it was. It was corrupt, and the reason it was corrupt was because there was a dictatorship that crushed any kind of dissent, that forced any kind of dissent out of the party or marginalized it and demonized it, as people like Joanna Cherry have said, as people like Joan McAlpin have said, people like Douglas Chapman have said. You know, these were all loyal party members, many of them very, very long-standing party members, who legitimately raise an alarm and are then treated as some kind of fifth columnists. I don't know what you can. That is entirely characteristic with all the trademarks of corrupt dictatorships. I don't know what else you can call it.
Let's last few questions, Stuart. Let's talk a little bit about your blog in the general terms. I mean, is there anything that you've done on the blog over the years that you've regretted? Is there anyone you've monstered and then thought that was a bit too harsh?
I mean, I'd love to give you a longer, more complicated answer than no, but no. All joking aside, I can put my hand on my heart. I don't think there's anyone in the entire 15-year history of Wings. I don't think there's anyone we've been at all unfair to. We've been quite harsh on some people, but they fully deserved being treated harshly by us. So no, honestly, there's nothing I regret.
Stuart, thank you so much for talking to us.
Pleasure, Connor.